Great, thank you. Just needed to find the unmute button. So thank you so much, Lacey. We're excited to be closing out today for you all. We wanted to just sort of quickly run through our agenda with you today. So as you mentioned, we are going to be talking about transition and sort of advancing your strategy during times of transition. So we will spend some time sort of talking about the current state of social impact, both in terms of the evolving field, but also the evolving role for practitioners, which we know is top of mind for a lot of folks right now. We'll spend some time diving in a little bit more deeply on actual moments of transition that we know some of you may be experiencing or have already experienced or may be on the horizon down the road. But we definitely want to talk about, as we see more and more companies reaching out to us because of moments of change that are allowing them to step back and think about their strategy and examine sort of programs and path forward. And then I think on a more practical level, we'll walk through actual approach that you can take to actually take a step back and reflect on your current strategy, and more specifically, how you want to evolve your CSR programs and initiatives or hone in on community investments. So just to quickly kick off with sort of who we are and what we do, Mandy and I are from Changing Our World, which is a social impact consulting firm. We work with both nonprofits on their fundraising and strategic planning process, but also certainly with corporations around designing and implementing their purpose-driven programs. We're lucky to be longtime partners of ACCP, and a majority of our current and former clients are members. So we always love having the opportunity to share specifically with this network. So thank you. And then lastly, we are part of the Omnicom Group Network, which, if you're not familiar, is a large communications holding company. So we partner with many of our sister agencies that have deep expertise in PR and branding, digital communications, and more. In terms of our specific capabilities, if you aren't familiar with our work, we definitely find ourselves working, in all aspects of social impact strategy and design, but just wanted to kind of call out the primary places where we're often partnering with our clients. So certainly around social impact strategy or platform design, which is what we'll spend a little bit of time talking about today, signature program development, diversity, equity, inclusion, specifically, I think, focusing in on ways to infuse DE&I into existing programs and initiatives, employee engagement and volunteerism, strategic partnerships with nonprofit organizations, and then certainly we have been spending a lot of time historically talking about goals and measurement, but I think more recently, really the role that this plays in telling your social impact story. So that is who we are and what we do. And I will pass it to Mandy to talk a little bit about the evolving landscape.
Perfect, thank you. So we're going to focus throughout the session, and as Maureen mentioned, call out in a few moments some specific times of transition that come up a lot, but we'd be remiss not to mention that it's always a good idea to regularly take a step back and reassess your strategy. So yes, this session is about kind of using those times of transition as a springboard for refining strategy, but we generally recommend that every 3 to 5 years or so, companies take a step back and do an assessment. It doesn't have to be super in-depth each time, but taking a step back every so often to say, are we still focused on the right things? Are we accomplishing our goals, or do we need to adjust our approach? How has the business evolved, and are there new opportunities for integration? And are we still aligned to the needs and expectations of our stakeholders? Even if the business itself is relatively stable, I think what we're seeing, and what we'll get into more in a moment, is that stakeholders and expectations around CSR and ESG are constantly evolving, and the pace is only picking up. So using kind of some of those changes as a way to take a step back and make sure you're aligned is super important, really pretty often in having a strategy cycle that's, every 3 to 5 years is really important. In terms of the field itself, Maureen, if you want to go to the next slide, across every single sector, we work with clients in all different industries, and certainly some of them are experiencing change at a more rapid pace. But I would say across all sectors, the role of the corporate citizenship professional has evolved quite drastically in recent years. Going back 15 to 20 years ago, perhaps, there, sort of the era of more traditional corporate philanthropy, the focus was around being a good grant maker. The corporate giving team or foundation was generally quite siloed from the business. It was an add-on and an aside. And then there was a period, throughout the early 2000s until fairly recently, where I think the conversation was very much focused on, there was significant movement towards greater business alignment, and CSR practitioners were working to break down those silos and help the business see how addressing community needs and social issues could support broader business goals, including things like employee engagement and consumer engagement. But the conversation was still always about making the case. It was, the CSR practitioner and CSR team developing a strategy alongside the business strategy, going on roadshows to build bridges within the business to make those connections where they were possible. Now, and I'd be interested to hear, when we get to the Q&A, reflections from folks on this call, what you all are seeing, but our team has seen over the past few years a very noticeable acceleration of that trajectory of greater business integration. And actually, even finally, that shift that I think we've all been talking about in this space for a long time, where we are going from the CSR team banging on the door of executives to make our case and help them see how we can work together, to CSR team being invited to the table, being asked for advice and expertise, being treated like a core business function, and asked to help define how and where social impact works and fits into the business strategy in a truly integrated way, and what is the role of it in the brand as well. We can go to the next slide. With that shift, and perhaps largely driving it, I think, is that there's finally a real recognition that a company's commitment to CSR, ESG, social impact really does have a direct and substantial impact on business performance and growth. There's been, like I said, sort of this noticeable tipping point in stakeholders' expectations and demands, frankly, of companies around their social and environmental impact. And there's rapidly increasing transparency around these efforts. So for years, there were studies that said consumers say they would prefer brands that support causes, but now consumers are much savvier about seeking out how companies' business practices align to their statements and what they are actually doing to invest in community. And consumers are using social media to become advocates for or against companies whose values and actions that they question. It's been well documented at this point that younger generations of employees, millennials and now Gen Z, demand jobs with purpose and companies with a clear commitment to social issues. No doubt the Great Resignation is just going to add to that pressure. And perhaps, I don't know if it's underrated, but one of the biggest impacts, just in how quickly it has moved corporate practices, is the investor community's growing focus on ESG. I think that's led to, a lot of what we've noticed is that at the beginning of any sort of strategy planning engagement, we interview executives, and really 5 to 8 years ago, the the conversation was, this stuff is great, but it doesn't really have an impact on our financials. And now it's very well understood that it does, and that the investor community very much is interested. The SEC has said it will be issuing guidance on ESG disclosure this year. So I think that's really accelerated the pace of focus on this space at sort of the boardroom and C-suite level. So altogether, those factors have contribute to us reaching a tipping point where even the most old school and fiscally conservative executives have to reckon with the reality that ESG and CSR now is a meaningful and immediate impact on a company's ability to attract and retain talent and build loyalty, and ultimately on a company's financial performance. So that's sort of kind of the big picture landscape, where regardless of individual transitions you may be going through, I think the field is going through, and no doubt is having an impact on all of your jobs.
So we do have a polling question here. As Mandy mentioned, assessing your strategy should be something that's ongoing, but we did want to spend some time focusing on specific moments that might require you to take a step back and assess your strategy in a new way. So I can't vote, but there is a poll up now, and we wanted you to just think about, in the last year, have you experienced a major transition across your company? Whether it's a merger or acquisition, change in senior leadership, moving to a new geographic location, increased expectations around ESG reporting, or one that we're seeing a lot of is really restructuring strategy to emphasize an increased focus at the corporate level on DE&I or sustainability. Okay. Well, as predicted, restructuring to focus on DE&I and sustainability commitments is definitely a popular one, 69%. And certainly no surprise that slightly behind ESG reporting and change in senior leadership is also another, I think, critical driver that we often see. So this is helpful framing, and thank you for your participation. So we'll kind of talk through these just at a high level, but mergers and acquisitions, although it looked like it rated low here, I would actually say this is one that I think we have a great deal of experience with, either because a company has brought us in as they're going through an acquisition, or because while we're working with a client, they've had to experience this, or a merger and acquisition has been announced. This is one that can be tough, obviously for a number of reasons. It can certainly be, I think, really unsettling, particularly when you're waiting to learn if there's going to be restructuring or relocations. But I think that what we know and what we've seen is that, the CSR strategy of a new shared company can really be important, both because it can really serve as a focal point, I think, for bringing together separate cultures, but also, engaging a new collective workforce. So in some instances, it might be really clear that one company's strategy is sort of staying intact or staying in place. But I think we really think, is particularly when you're talking about similar industries, there's a really important opportunity to kind of take a step back, determine where there's synergies across existing strategies. Is there alignment on goals, and objectives of your current program? And then really, are there legacy relationships on either side that should be explored or evolved and maintained? Or, I think what we see a lot of is where can you responsibly exit away from historical partnerships, which we know can be tough and requires a thoughtful strategy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We've seen a lot of this in terms of, again, I think assessing a lot of the legacy programs and strategies. But I think the other thing that's really important to take into an account if you do ultimately experience this is culture. We worked with TD Ameritrade for a long time, both when they were acquiring Scottrade, but then also when they were going through their own acquisition by Charles Schwab. And I think it was really important to understand the unique issues and cultures across, the businesses, but also I think it was really important for us to highlight the places where we needed to go deep during that transition. So thinking about employee engagement and internal communications during those times of transition was critically important.
New leadership at the highest levels, right? Similar to M&A, often goes hand in hand with mergers and acquisitions, but it's a time when the whole business strategy may be up for discussion. And with that discussion comes a consideration of how and where social impact work fits in, and opportunities to potentially embed it more deeply into the business strategy. And even if the business strategy is not changing, right, it's just a new leader and the business is largely staying the course, new leadership may bring with it a new style and philosophical approach to CSR and ESG and how they fit in. Without a doubt, then the next generation of leaders has a very different perspective on this work than those of the past. Obviously, there's exceptions on either end of the spectrum, but as a whole, attitudes are changing rapidly, as we talked about in sort of the evolution of the field. And today's and tomorrow's leaders have come up and really cut their teeth in this higher expectations environment. And so they're naturally prioritizing ESG performance in a way that's really quite a departure from the overriding attitude in boardrooms just 10 years ago. We're currently working with a major healthcare company where there's new leadership. And I would say in this case, both scenarios apply. There's both a shift in the business strategy and a change in senior leaders' vision and philosophy, and really a greater emphasis on the importance of CSR and social impact and sustainability. And they're combining into a really huge opportunity, both where the business is going and the leadership's new commitment, a really huge opportunity to transform the company's CSR strategy and really embed its commitments to health and health equity and sustainability much more deeply into the business. And if you have new leadership, I think it's a great opportunity to engage them, regardless of, often it's people who have been promoted from internally, and it may not seem like this is necessarily a whole new guard coming in, but take that opportunity to try to get on their calendar and understand what's their vision for the business and their vision for CSR, and use that vision to identify new potential areas of focus and opportunities for collaboration with different business units. To the point Maureen made with mergers and acquisitions, exit legacy partnerships or programs that may have been pet projects of the old guard, but aren't serving your goals. And also it can be a great opportunity to make the case for more resources, right? Budgets get kind of like set at a certain place, and do your benchmarking and see where your budget, your team size stack up to your peers, and use it as an opportunity to make the case for more resources if that's appropriate and needed, and where is it not, frankly.
The next one is new geographic locations. So whether that's totally moving to a new headquarters community or opening a new location, we definitely find that this is a great opportunity to build relationships in the local community. Certainly there's always the desire to be seen as a strong corporate citizen, and certainly bringing value to the community. So I think our clients are often seeking to better understand what are the most pressing issues and in that community, want to get to know some of the other funders there, leading nonprofits, government officials. I think local community foundation is always a great place to start because they're a wealth of knowledge in terms of pressing needs and gaps in funding. But I think the other place that we've helped a number of our clients think through is when they're expanding globally, and historically, perhaps a lot of the programming has been domestic here in the US, thinking about how to evolve the strategy and grow it, and what adjustments might need to be made in terms of, policies and procedures, but also certainly partners and the way those partnerships are activated at the local level, recognizing that there's, might need to be shifts and adjustments. So again, whether it's, a real move to a new physical building or just that the business is growing and expanding globally, another really critical moment to kind of take a step back and say, is this still the right fit for where our footprint, currently is evolving to, or do we need to evolve and adjust?
All right. Next is increased expectations around ESG reporting, right? These are all obviously interconnected, but this one very much driven by some of the other ones we've talked about. I think, what's coming up a lot lately is that there's an expectation to evolve from, the community involvement story being told through anecdotal pictures and stories to really reporting, setting goals and KPIs, providing more transparency around what's your strategy and what's your approach and what's the actual impact you're trying to achieve. If this is coming up for you, some considerations to work through. Has your company done a materiality assessment? Do you know which issues are the most material to the business? There's kind of two tracks to this. If you have an existing ESG or sustainability reporting team, they've probably done materiality assessments. The opportunity here is more about collaborating more effectively with that team. And, instead of having two parallel strategies, ESG and sustainability over here and community over here, using the expectations around reporting as a bridge to bring those strategies together and your work together more effectively. On the other hand, we've had some clients where that team doesn't yet exist, and therefore it's coming, the requests are coming to the community involvement team, even if they're not experts in supply chain and environmental, impact. But if that's the case, it's an opportunity to take the lead on the process, to lead a materiality assessment, to identify which ESG frameworks, whether that's like PRI or SASB, Carbon Disclosure Project, all of those, which ones make sense for your business to align to, and build out that bigger CSR or ESG framework. It doesn't mean you need to own each piece. You don't need to become the expert in each area of, supply chain management, but someone does, there's all companies now need this kind of overarching strategy. And if you take the lead on it, your team takes the lead on it, you can sort of ensure that it has that social impact focus baked in from the beginning, and really help shape this company's story in a way that elevates that work and your community investments work. So now I think, oh wait, do we have one more?
One more, yeah, the most popular one. Really thinking about a greater emphasis on DE&I and sustainability, particularly how to align and integrate, I think, to the broader corporate commitments. So similar to Mandy was just speaking to, this may be outside of your purview, but if you were focused on corporate giving, how can you consider those broader commitments and adjust or augment your strategy to really reflect those priorities? This doesn't necessarily mean, totally creating new standalone pillars or programs, although it can. But I think it's taking a step back and looking at what you have in place and determining how you can infuse those priorities into your existing focus areas or guidelines. And so it's a really, I think, critical moment to assess and say, does this fit within the pillars that we have, or do we need to make refinements? And so we definitely have worked, this has been certainly an uptick, I think, in requests that we've seen, you know, in the lighter touch or more deep level. Last year, we worked closely with Excel Energy Foundation in this very area. There was an absolute desire and mandate from leadership to more closely align the foundation's focus areas with the corporate priorities, specifically around DE&I. And so going through an assessment process allowed us to actually come back with a refined, narrowed focus areas, but ones that infuse DE&I integration within them, and ultimately gave the company an opportunity to sort of brand their giving framework in a new way and tell a stronger social impact story. So again, I think with all of these strategy refinements, we often find an opportunity to tell a greater story and make sure that, you know, you're thinking about these strategies and programs as tools for, you know, your stakeholders to know what you stand for employees to sort of rally around and get excited. So ultimately, those are a lot of different moments of change and transition. But again, we think that they're becoming ideal moments to kind of step back and reflect on strategy. Then we will talk a little bit more about designing your strategy, going through the process.
Yeah, so we'll walk through the steps of a typical planning process at the highest level, just to give you a sense of the steps you might embark on in you know, your process or in your time of transition. We break the process down into these 3 phases, and we'll go into more detail in subsequent slides, but just at the highest level, Immerse is sort of about understanding your business and landscape. Where's the business headed? And again, this is, you work inside, you know, it's different for an outside consultant. We have to learn the business, but I would say that it's important, even as an insider who may have been at your company for many, many years, to take a pause and say, where is the business headed right now? What is the strategy looking at for, you know, the future 3 to 5 years from now? And also, you know, what sort of branding and purpose and values work has been done recently? What core tenets do you need to align to, whether it's innovation or collaboration or customer centricity? Those are the kinds of things that you want to understand about where the business is headed, that you want to pull through into your CSR or social impact strategy. Immerse is also about the broader landscape that you operate in. What are your competitors doing, and standards and best practices in the industry, and then pressing needs in the communities or issues you want to address. Design is where we bring together all the insights from that immersion work into actionable frameworks, guidelines, governance, structure to bring the strategy to life. And implement is where you really do bring it all to life, engage partners in your efforts, and then assess your results and start all over again.
Okay, so we will spend a little bit of time walking through kind of that phased approach. But to start, the internal assessment, which personally is one of my favorite parts of the work, you know, this is typically where we always start to sort of take a step back and really understand, you know, the current and historical programming, whether that's at the broader CSR level to include things like the environment or workplace, or the broader business commitments, or specifically if we're talking about, you know, corporate giving or foundation giving. I think that the internal assessment is really an opportunity to build a foundation and case before developing a new or refined strategy. So typically we start with some sort of audit. I think that different companies have varying levels of understanding around where their current commitments are and sort of looking at the data in the weeds. But I think more broadly, really taking a step back to look at your core business priorities and sort of where there's gaps, and conducting kind of that comprehensive review of existing programs, your grant making portfolio, employee engagement efforts, and sort of any measurement that you have, data that you have there, your existing policies and procedures that are in place, or maybe perhaps are not in place. And I think, thinking more broadly about the corporate assets that you're currently leveraging, or perhaps you could be leveraging. This is also, I know Mandy mentioned earlier, benchmarking and sort of making the case, but this is also a really good opportunity to look at the current resources that you have in place. And so looking at your budget, looking at the measurement tools or communication tools and vehicles that you have access to, and certainly your staffing, and sort of making note of where you think you might need to kind of dive in deeper to explore opportunities to expand. In terms of soliciting feedback from leadership, which we mentioned earlier, and certainly also getting employee perspectives, I think with senior leadership, it's really important, as Mandy already mentioned, to discuss kind of the current business priorities and strategies. We've had a number of CEOs say to us, I hope you've watched my Investor Day presentation, because that really sums up, like, in a nutshell, exactly what the strategy is and what we want external stakeholders and investors to understand about where we're taking the business. And so really getting, I think, that clear articulation to understand points of alignment, but also gathering candid feedback from folks around their attitudes and sort of what they think is working well or not working well around your existing programs or focus areas. I think sometimes we get a lot of positive feedback, but oftentimes we hear, like, why have we been doing this for so long? And is there an opportunity to evolve, because there might be a disconnect between priorities? I think it's also a great opportunity to understand if your leadership has awareness for your efforts. Like, is your communications working? Sometimes it's not the team's fault or focus in place, but it's helpful to kind of understand, do you need to kind of shift the way that messaging is being delivered and developed? And then again, I think we're not seeing it as much anymore, because I think a lot of leaders are bought in already on the fact that this is imperative to business strategy. But I do think when you are changing focus, this is a really great way to kind of create and secure your champions from the onset, so that they feel like they've had a voice in the strategy development, and certainly can kind of see their own opinions and feedback in the ultimate plan. In terms of, I think, broader employee feedback, I think it varies from company to company if this is something that you want to do in the upfront sort of planning process, or perhaps at a later point. But I think if employee engagement is a critical component of your strategy, and volunteering or other kind of ways of engaging employees in community is important, then you may want to kind of solicit that feedback up front, and kind of really understand whether it's through surveying or focus groups. Are there particular areas that employees have deep affinity for, whether it's designing programs for employees that align to your strategy, or coming up with ways to support their own, personal passions, because there's themes bubbling up that clearly don't align with kind of your business priorities and focus. I think it's also a really great way to understand how employees like to receive information. I know that's a big challenge for a lot of our clients, is, this notion of cutting through the clutter amongst a million other messages that are being sent out. And I think understanding the drivers for why people want to participate in these sort of activities or events beyond the obvious of contributing to the community, but, is it because they want to network with their peers or be in front of senior leaders, or again, like, just have a break to feel good? I think it's a really great way to kind of uncover those drivers. And then, of course, certainly, what are the types of activities? We've seen a lot of companies evolve in the last 2 years because traditional volunteering hasn't really been an option. And so what are the other ways that you can engage employees and have them feel like they're part of your programs and strategies, and kind of get feedback on that? Mandy already mentioned the materiality assessment, but that's something that if you are looking at, again, the broader CSR strategy or ESG, issues and priorities, it's really that process of engaging stakeholders to identify, the social, environmental, and governance issues that are most material to your business, but also where are the issues that perhaps are challenges for the business that you now need to certainly report against and show progress against. So that is internal. Externally, I think that it's important to certainly demonstrate, the landscape that you're operating in, and certainly ensure that your current approach is still meeting the needs of your communities, but also is on par with your peers. And it also, I think, offers an opportunity to look at the landscape and identify points of distinction for your business to tell that compelling impact story. So in terms of the process, we often do some degree of industry best practice review and benchmarking, looking at reports like ACCP is making the case, I think is a great summary of a lot of the data out there. CECP is giving a numbers report that comes out on an annual basis. These are the types of, I think, tools that will help arm you with the data that you might need to help evolve certain aspects of your program. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. One sip of water. But if you're thinking about making the case again in increasing your budget or increasing your staff, or incorporating new policies, paid time off policy, matching gifts, like this is the kind of data that can help make that case. The resources in the chat. And then I think in terms of benchmarking, it depends on the culture of your organization. We really recommend doing this if it's going to advance your strategy. So, that might mean thinking beyond just your competitive peer set to what's the real best in class approach out there. So if you're specifically, I don't know, trying to think about a signature program, you might not look at your direct peer set. You might say, okay, who are the companies that are really known for a branded initiative? They get a lot of recognition. What can we glean from how they communicate to their stakeholders, to how they've branded their program, their digital assets, just really honing in on the benchmarking that's going to be applicable to where you're trying to focus. But it may be that your leadership is really interested in peers and kind of seeing how you compare, and that might allow you to identify opportunities to advance certain aspects. I think the other aspect of benchmarking that's important is that there is a lot that can be gleaned through, publicly available information. But if you want to do something that's going to really require kind of that nitty-gritty behind the scenes information, you're thinking about launching a global volunteer program, evolving it from a domestic program, that might require interviews and reaching out to organizations, say, hey, can we chat about your program? Can I understand your governance structure? Kind of what vendors are you working with? How have you evolved your program and your staffing model to kind of get in front of a new audience? And so I think it's really important to think about the most applicable information that's going to drive your strategy forward. And then if you are thinking about geographic priorities, if hometown, for example, is critical to your strategy, or there's key communities that are really important, spending some time doing that kind of community landscape, which I know I mentioned a little bit earlier, but is there a review of relevant community needs reports or data, and talking to local nonprofit leaders to understand local needs, again, talking to the local community foundation, but really understanding the gaps in funding that might exist and how you can hone in on those areas. And then lastly, I think specific to cause areas, as you're going through this process and there's themes bubbling up, whether it's new causes that make sense for your business or thinking about your existing focus areas, we always recommend doing some level of cause area research. And I think this is helpful, as we mentioned, every 3 to 5 years, taking that step back, understanding the latest trends and interventions. Are there new successful or evidence-based approaches? And again, looking at where there might be gaps in support. We also recommend, looking at other funders that are in this space. Is it cluttered now? Maybe it wasn't 5 years ago. And so is there an opportunity to look at kind of niche areas within a cause that may provide an opportunity for differentiation or opportunities for collaboration. And then certainly kind of getting a lay of the land on nonprofit players in the space so that you can better understand programs, their capabilities, and have them in mind when you get to the point that you're ready to implement your new strategy.
So there are a couple questions in the chat. There's some that I was going to leave for the end, and maybe we do come back to the first question about reporting at the end. And the most recent one I can address. We're going to move to strategy development. And I think that gets at the last question, but there's two in the middle of the chat that are very much about the internal assessment. So I think let's pause and reflect on those, and then I'll talk through strategy development quickly. The first is what are key items or questions to include or review as a part of a CSR audit? What we typically look at there, and Maureen, jump in, but we will do like a historical giving analysis. So understanding where the dollars are actually going, you would be surprised, but quite often teams don't actually have a really good handle on what issues, where the majority of the dollars are going. Often there's findings that like, we think whether it's cause areas or we think we're doing more larger gifts, but actually turns out like 80% of our budget is tied up in small, reactive, short-term gifts. So it's some analysis of the giving, depending on what's in the purview of your team and your kind of CSR department, looking at employee engagement data and metrics are some of the main things we're sort of thinking about there in terms, and then policies and practices that you have in place. Do you have, a formal matching gifts program, formal VPTO policy, things like that? Maureen, anything I'm missing?
No, it's essentially that, taking a good look at all the program strategies, policies, and data.
Yeah. And then there's a question that says, are there ever times when an internal assessment ends up reaffirming that your strategy is on the right track, or is it always meant as a way to change or update your strategy? I would say like it is definitely reaffirming a lot of the time. Like we've worked with clients where we do it. Usually when we get engaged is because there's some sort of recognition of a need for a change to bring in an external consultant. Not necessarily totally shifting focus. The project Maureen talked about with Excel, like they had the right focus areas. They wanted help infusing DEI and kind of sharpening some of that. But usually there's like big moments of change where something needs to change with your strategy, whether it's focus areas or being more focused with your giving. And then there's regular, like every couple years assessment that is very much about affirming where you're on the right track. And then no one is perfect. We're never perfect. Programs operate the way they operate in real life is not how we've drawn them up in a deck. And so it's usually for those kinds of assessments, it's just like learnings of, we should kind of tweak the kinds of programs we're funding because this new type is working a little bit better, or we're not getting the metrics back. We need to change our measurements because the nonprofits can't measure these things, like that kind of.
And sometimes there's new interventions or types of programs that are proving to be really successful, or perhaps you've made a small investment in something that you think you can take to scale and go bigger. And so it's kind of doing that assessment to find some of those little nuggets of information that might take your program to the next level.
Yeah. Okay. And then the next question I will address as we talk through strategy development, which is saying, what do you do if your internal and external assessments contradict each other? And the example I think was that internal folks think the program is strong, externally people think it's not making an impact. Strategy development is like, it's an art and a science. It's where you bring all that feedback together, some of which aligns and some of which doesn't, and you try to come up with something cohesive that, you know, it's often, there's compromise involved, but I think it's also taking whatever your North Star is, whether, you know, ideally aligned to leadership vision and business strategy, and saying that's going to take priority and precedent here in my decision making. And so if it's social impact and community engagement, then those perspectives are really important. If it's employee engagement, as it is for some companies' programs, then those perspectives might carry a little bit more weight. But that's sort of what the balance that we do in strategy development and design.
And I think if it's a matter of external community stakeholders not feeling you're making the impact, then it's, and you internally you feel you are, then that might be a communications challenge. And so thinking about, again, the meaningful approach to measurement, are you just telling a story about the number of people that you're reaching and focus primarily on outputs, or do you have a compelling case around outcomes and thinking about how you're getting in front of those external audiences to talk about your strategy consistently so that it's something you're known for? That comes back to a different topic, which is comms strategy.
No, if you go to the next slide, we can talk through just kind of the nuts and bolts. So the goal is really to take, in this step, is really to take all those layers of information and make some key decisions. What are you going to focus on? How are you going to tackle it? I think that's the how is often left out. Oh, we know that we're going to focus on childhood cancer, but we haven't identified the types of programs we want to support. That's something we're really passionate about getting really specific about. And then what resources are you lining up to address those issues? And then pulling it all together into a clear, digestible framework, actionable program guidelines. As for the framework component of that, do not underestimate the power of visuals. That's very like simple, but like those house type diagrams with a mission at the top and pillars underneath, it goes a really, really long way in helping people understand your strategy and how the various pieces and programs fit together. It gives you the space to say 90% of what we do aligns to our strategic focus areas, but over here on the side is where we have our programs to support employee passions and disaster relief, and that's still a part of our strategy and our program. It also allows you to draw direct connections to the corporate mission and values and, you know, whatever other departments you may need to, you know, business unit led efforts that you need to fit in and draw connections to. You can sort of do it all very visually in one slide. Within priority areas, as I mentioned, the how is really important. So the what specifically are you trying to achieve in the issue areas you're focused on, and if possible, you know, sometimes this comes later once you're engaging partners more, but identifying specific goals and KPIs for success within those. And then at a high level, the how, like, and maybe examples of who you will partner with, but roughly what size and types of grants you're going to make, what types of interventions are you going to invest in, what other assets are you going to bring to bear, what beyond, you know, philanthropic dollars or employee time, is it going to be expertise or in-kind services? All those kinds of details really help move from a theory on paper to an actionable strategy. And then the last thing in strategy development that we always advise spending some time on is outlining kind of your overall budget and operational plan. Not only what budget do you need for funding partners, but what's your staffing plan? Do you have the technology you need for grant administration, volunteerism, or, you know, are investments needed in those areas, comm support? All of that type of stuff should be considered in the strategy development.
And then I think this is our last slide, but implementation and sort of designing your implementation roadmap. I mean, this can take many different forms, and this always certainly I think tailored to the elements that rise to the top in terms of priorities, whether that's around giving, broader CSR, employee engagement, or all of the above. But these are kind of a lot, frequently the common next steps that we focus on in an implementation plan. So certainly once the plan is in place, there's varying levels of socialization depending on the culture of your company. I mean, we have some companies where there's full authority with the CSR team, and others where there's months and months of socialization. So whether that's, developing a high level strategy overview deck and sort of pitching it to a range of internal stakeholders, or getting in front of your board if you're a foundation, really taking that time to kind of get the buy-in and feedback to fine tune things. Often, if there are shifts or there's new elements, definitely, again, we've mentioned a couple of times here, but revisiting those existing policies and procedure documents to sort of reflect the changes that you've made. Then, I know I mentioned early on, but really thoughtfully and responsibly, I think approaching an exit strategy. So if you are moving away from key partnerships, being really transparent about the new strategic focus and sort of rationale, why having those conversations directly with your partners, particularly if they're, especially your longer term partners, to sort of give them time to prepare or be aware, or you might want to consider awarding bridge grants for a shorter period of time. Or perhaps talking about opportunities where an organization might fit within a new focus for you, but really being thoughtful about that approach. And then with any new strategy comes a new approach to measurement and evaluation. So thinking about, the goals that are associated with the strategy, but also I think considering the information that you've gleaned from your cause area research, are there specific metrics that you want to track or outcomes that you seek to achieve in order to kind of demonstrate progress against the goals that you've set. And then lastly, communications. Again, we know it's so important to tell that clear and concise impact story. So, really taking the time, whether it's you have an internal resource or partnering with your comms team to develop that robust internal and external comms strategy to tell the story. So that is the end. There's a couple of questions, I think. I'm just trying to find them.
Yeah. So the first one has been in the longest, so Kara has been patiently waiting. The question is, does the S in ESG does not have the same set of measurement standards and guidelines as, say, sustainability? Do you think consistent measurement or reporting standards are on the horizon as more analysts model health and value of corporate ESG efforts? So obviously, we don't know definitively like what will come of this, but it's definitely something that I think everyone in this space is always grappling with, as like social impact is so varied, and there is not a carbon emissions that every company should be tracking against, and so it's a lot more complicated. There's no like simple silver bullet quantitative sort of metric, but I do think, and I'm just surmising, I do think that there will be more qualitative guidance and standards around what is your strategy? Do you have, and people who filled out DJSI for years will be familiar with the kind of thinking, like, do you have a logic model or frameworks? Those kinds of questions to understand, and how do you think about alignment to the business? Those questions that many of us have answered within program and platforms, I don't know, in indices like DJSI for years. I think the broader analyst community is going to become savvier to thinking about social impact in that way. But, there isn't like the magical carbon emissions metric or diversity metric that there are in the other areas of ESG. And then the last one is, how do you manage a strategy or development of focus areas that helps address community needs when they may be different in each geographic area? We could probably spend an hour on the different options because that's always a consideration. And I think it depends on like, is this a component of your strategy? Is it, you know, often there will be, here's our big national or global focus area. And then we have also a grant program for community needs because we need that on the ground community need responsiveness. On the other hand, if your entire strategy is about community needs, but they vary community to community, to geography, it may be thinking about the type of funder you are, the way you enter communities, how you engage is what your strategy is. It's about engaging the local community and letting them guide you. Maureen, what else?
Yeah, and I think also if you do have a focus area that is defined, and that too may have different application in different regions depending on cultures or access, and so it's also thinking about that as well. There's a lot of considerations, whether it's thinking about global volunteerism and what that means for employees in different regions. So I think geography plays a role, an important role in all aspects of strategy.
Well, Maureen and Mandy, thank you so much. This was a very robust conversation, a lot of great ideas around like how do you go through all of these transition periods. And I think as many of us in CSR can relate, it has felt like the last 2 years have been 2 years of transition. And maybe for many of our attendees, they've done multiple of these transitions, not just one type. So of great information shared today. I think you have one more slide that tells people how to get in touch with you both if they had any other questions or follow-up. So I just want to flag that.
Thank you, Lacey.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a great way to close out our CSR Marketplace Live. We hope all of our attendees have really enjoyed today and all of the conversations over the last several days. So Sarah did drop a link in the chat. We value your feedback very much. It does help us to know what programming and information and topics are valuable to you as we really seek to support the professionals serving the field of CSR moving forward. So thank you all for joining us. Mandy and Maureen, thank you for sharing such great information, and we'll see y'all soon.
Thank you. Take care.